Hi there. Apologies for the late-ish video, work has been a lot recently. Today I'll be looking at another video from our favorite Bolivian coup-denying liberal, David Pakman. I again reiterate that I don't know much about this guy aside from the 2 videos I've seen from him, but quite a few of you have sent this video my way, so I thought why not. Now this is less a rebuttal and more a commentary on what he's trying to do, basically how not to defend the idea of socialism. To get the actually educational part of the video out of the way first, he doesn't define socialism correctly, by repeatedly expanding the definition to meaninglessness. He repeatedly tries to establish that social democracy is somehow socialist, or socialistic, whatever that means, while at the same time attempting to denigrate actual socialism. He makes strange, unsubstantiated statements about what Marxism and its goals are, and finishes off with basically yet another limp call for more social democracy, that somehow is the only true, pure, achievable socialism to him, despite his own admittance that he isn't a socialist. Finally, he doesn't actually debunk the socialism has never worked argument in any meaningful way. Instead, he in a roundabout way advocates for capitalism in yet another episode of Nordic model obsessive brain rot. If you want an actually decent attempt at answering the socialism has always failed nonsense, take a look at my video titled Ex-Socialist Country Has Failed is a Stupid Argument. Now, the correct way to go about discussing and engaging with our heritage is as such. Number 1, actually investigate what socialism means and see if the definition fits. In the case of the USSR, Cuba, etc., it did. The argument that wasn't real socialism is a useless and incorrect one the vast majority of the time, so please don't use it. It just makes you look like an intellectual coward. Use it only when it's actually valid, like in Venezuela's case, which hasn't in any meaningful way dismantled capitalism despite its other interesting and laudable achievements. See my previous response to Pakman for details. Number 2. Don't brush their mistakes under the rug or ignore them. Bring them front and center and criticize them. What did they do right? What did they do wrong? You should be unapologetic in interrogating and learning from our tradition. Otherwise, how will we ever learn to do better? To simply dismiss them as not having been socialism because they make you uncomfortable will either lead you to repeating their mistakes or result in you adopting limp social democratic rhetoric that won't fundamentally bring any meaningful change. For a brief intro to only a few mistakes, check out my Former Socialism's Faults video. Finally, and this is the boring answer, read. There's so much nuance to every discussion around socialism as an ideology. The various nations that championed it, various policies, etc. Anyone who tells you not to read, that's a waste of time or whatever else, is trying to control the narrative by keeping you ignorant, simple as. With that said, the video in question is titled Debunked! Socialism has never worked, which would be great if he did a decent job of it. Now the video is long, so I won't show all of it, only the parts that mess up, which is almost all of it sadly. Let's see what he did wrong and how we can go about this topic better in the future.
Many don't know much about the history of socialism, or even really understand what socialism actually is. They hear the word socialism and they think of authoritarian regimes like the Soviet Union or North Korea, or even worse, they might say, hey, socialism doesn't work when they're having a conversation about someone like Barack Obama, implying that Obama is himself a socialist.
Alright, I'm not in the mood to get into a whole discussion, but showing images of Catalonia, a temporary and short-lived, albeit lovely experiment that nevertheless didn't meaningfully establish socialism as an image of real socialism, because that's the implication here, compared to images of the USSR, a 70-year-long experiment that did establish socialism, or alternatively got a lot closer than Catalonia did, and actually threatened the capitalist world to its core, hence the non-stop demonization that's even seeped into so-called socialist discourse, as not real socialism, is, well, disingenuous. It's unhelpful and disingenuous, not my run-on sentence, but the argument. Firstly, the only reason Catalonia is praised is because in the end, it didn't succeed in any meaningful sense, aside from the romantic imagery that I also enjoy and am inspired by. If it did manage to hold on, establish industry, and develop into a model actively challenging global capitalism like the USSR did, then you'd be right there sticking next to pictures of Stalin as evil, authoritarian, not real socialism. Catalonia had summary executions, unfortunately named concentration camps for political prisoners, mandatory conscription, political purges of various stripes, I can go on. If they succeeded, you'd be forced to learn, granted completely butchered versions, about them in 8th grade history class right next to the evil gulags. Don't get me started on the authoritarian nonsense. Anarchists relied on authoritarian means, social democrats did and still do, all capitalist nations do, and yes, even socialism at times needs to resort to so-called authoritarian means. This isn't a criticism of anarchism or anything else, just that we should be honest with our terms. Authoritarianism is such a flexible term in political science that you can bend it to fit practically any and every society that has ever existed. Furthermore, its use and overuse as a pejorative to shut down discussion and inquiry into, for example, former socialism, further renders the term more or less meaningless in any serious discussion. If Pakman truly had an issue with authoritarianism, he should definitely have an issue with social democracy and capitalism, yet he doesn't. Secondly, it's unhelpful because it plays right into the hands of the enemies of socialism by repeating something that just isn't true. That claim being anytime a socialist attempt has some defect, we as socialists start to crying, "No, not real socialism, it'll be different next time, I swear," which couldn't be further from the truth. Not only do we affirm that Cuba, the USSR, Vietnam, etc. are genuine examples of socialism, despite their defects, but in fact we appreciate those defects because we can study and learn from them, rather than brushing them aside for not adhering to some pure image of socialism we've conjured up in our minds. Finally, Pakman himself is a social democrat that doesn't like anarchism, so him playing this game, despite not actively subscribing to anarchism, is just strange and, I don't know, scummy. Like you're using an example of something you dislike just to take potshots at something else you dislike. Lack of ideological consistency just annoys me, I guess. Alright, now prepare for some brain rot, and I do apologize in advance for subjecting you to this.
Defined by a textbook, socialism is the collective ownership of a society's means of production. Means of production could be non-human resources used to produce things of economic value like real estate or farmland, natural resources, equipment, buildings, infrastructure, roads, and collective ownership of these things meaning workers or the public own them. Some define socialism as a system by which social equality can be achieved. In this broader way of thinking about it, socialism could mean any kind of socialistic philosophies or attitudes or tendencies, or a system that combines orthodox socialist practices with other constructs like capitalism.
Sufficiently cringed out yet? Good. Anything can be abstracted to the point of it not meaning anything anymore. We already did this with the term social democracy. It used to mean actually socialist policies, but then it morphed into what it means today, basically a kinder capitalism with some welfare. Why are you trying to do the same with the term socialism? No, socialism objectively isn't when the government does stuff, nor is it when we have a few more socialistic policies, which is a stupid idea in and of itself because government funding for the fire department and road infrastructure isn't fucking socialism. God, how many times do we need to go through this before it gets through to these types? Orthodox socialist practices fundamentally include the abolition of capitalism. This cannot be reconciled with other constructs like capitalism. You're trying to mix oil and water here, and it doesn't work.
For instance, you could say that some Scandinavian countries are socialistic.
No, you objectively can't. Again, public funding of healthcare isn't socialism. They're capitalist systems with a welfare nest, that's it.
By modern standards, not because they have a system where the government or workers own everything, but because they have a system where there's a relatively greater amount of intervention by democratic government.
Did you catch that? By democratic government. He's saying that to cover his ass because what he's saying also applies to fascism, for fuck's sake. This is what happens when you dilute the meaning of terms. You end up with wishy-washy nonsense you have to set 100 qualifiers to before being able to even engage in a simple discussion. Take a look, he'll throw in the qualifiers.
To protect socialistic ideals like egalitarianism, civil rights, equal education, environmentalism, and the prevention of abuse by actors in the free market. These are capitalist societies, and they're definitely not realizations of socialism as defined in a political science glossary, but these are manifestations of socialistic inclinations, especially when compared to what goes on in many other developed countries.
The aforementioned qualifiers. Yes, it absolves you somewhat, but again, prevention of abuse by actors in the free market is inherently not socialism, because under socialism, there isn't a free market. Arguably, there isn't one even under the most libertarian open capitalism practice today, and even more so under social democratic countries, but definitions don't seem to mean much here, so I'll look over that. Side note, I had to listen to this part several times because I couldn't get over my disgust of seeing a cop and some person draped in an LGBT flag doing a fucking chicken dance or whatever that was. Pain. Really encapsulates the liberal view that Pakman holds. See, funny cop do dance with the gays. We don't need socialism. Consume. Let's ignore the systemic injustices against minorities under social democracies, be it the Sami people or migrants from war-torn countries. It's just silly. Egalitarianism, civil rights, equal education, environmentalism are all well and good, but aren't what defines socialism. This isn't gatekeeping, just keeping definitions straight.
Socialism is an extremely broad umbrella term to describe a wide range of political, social, and economic systems, movements, and ideas.
Yes, but if you noticed, of all the symbols he showed, every single one aside from social democracy advocates for the complete abolition of capitalism. This is less socialism is good and more an attempt to rehabilitate social democracy as socialism. Again, definitions do matter.
And then over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, there were many, many different philosophies that branched out of this to form separate socialist intellectual movements. This is where the idea that socialism means any one thing is dispelled.
No, it isn't, because there are no Proudhonists, Owenists, or other utopians left. When you enter into serious political analysis, you either find those who advocate for capitalism, under various stripes, anarchists, or Marxists, and both of the latter want the abolition of capitalism and use a Marxian analysis of class society in their general approach, both of which advocate for the abolition of capitalism as an essential aspect of their philosophy. How many times do I need to repeat this? You're just muddying the water, intentionally or not. This is why I dislike the video. This will only confuse people and will require someone to actively unlearn incorrect nonsense before they feel comfortable in what socialism even is.
Then there's Marxism. Now, many people refer to Marxism colloquially as communism, even though communism can actually describe an array of different systems, some of which don't even involve a state.
No conception of communism involves a state. Communism is always stateless. When a party calls itself communist, that's because their aim is to reach communism. Just to clarify.
But Marxism is definitely not merely synonymous with socialism the way many people think. Marxism is a type of socialism or a type of communism, something very specific.
Yes, Marxism is something very specific, but the synonymous point is a bit The vast majority of socialists around the world are Marxists, with a smaller but still noticeable minority being anarchists. Social Democrats, of which politically involved members of organizations are relatively few in number, are not socialists. He himself says he isn't a socialist in the beginning of the video, but a social democrat. He recognizes the difference. In the academy, fine, you can entertain the idea that socialism at particular instances means something else, but in real life, if someone declares themselves a socialist to you, they're either an anarchist, Marxist, or someone that has misunderstandings as to what socialism really is, for example, the democratic socialist Bernie crowd.
But as an ultra-simplified overview, political Marxism is centered around class struggle, revolution, and Marx's historical theory of materialism.
That's enough of an overview, I guess, but it's historical materialism, not Marx's historical theory of materialism. Materialism has several codified definitions, particularly in philosophy, so precision in terms is useful here to avoid confusion.
Marxism advocates a revolution wherein a society's means of production are taken by force, rather than by reform or negotiation or slower forms of transition.
No, we advocate for revolution because we understand that the ruling class won't peacefully give up their wealth, power, and privilege. No Marxist wants violence. It's just that violence is imposed on us every single day under capitalism, and even the meekest attempts to fighting back are ruthlessly crushed. We'd love to just waltz in peacefully and begin the construction of socialism, but the very nature of capitalism prevents that. To paraphrase Castro, we exhausted every single peaceful avenue before choosing armed conflict. Also, slow transition has never worked. Ever. Not one single time. In fact, the exact opposite happens. Social Democrats that started along the slow transition line are now almost all, in fact all, cheerleaders of neoliberalism.
The means of production will then be controlled by a proletarian state, which in theory will lead to an egalitarian, stateless society that governs itself without coercive institutions.
Not exactly. No socialist has said dictatorship of the proletariat equals communism. Communism can only be established globally. You can't have an island of stateless, mindless, classless communism and an ocean of capitalism still nipping at its heels. There's a clear theory of transition under socialism that would have taken like 3 seconds to add, but you chose not to, further increasing the confusion. Probably because he's unaware of it. Also, where does he get this coercive institution nonsense from? Again, unaccountable coercive institutions exist and are quite brutal even in his beloved social democracies, so if you dislike their existence, you should notice the hypocrisy. Secondly, you're telling me the USSR, besieged on all sides, in the middle of a civil war, and invaded by over a dozen other countries, had to resort to coercive institutions? Color me surprised. I swear, social democrats clutch at their pearls when looking at actual attempts at socialism, but gladly look past the horrific exploitation social democracies take part in every single day. Immigrant labor, offshore tax havens for the wealthiest, the abuse of cheap third world labor, unequal exchange, the contribution to American military aggression against poor global south countries, on and on.
Really important point here. This is not what the Soviet Union or its, quote, communist successors achieved or were working toward, despite their pretenses. Bolshevism, Maoism, and the like are inherently right-wing, totalitarian perversions of Marxism.
There you go. Yep, that's the single stupidest thing I've heard all week. By the way, I'd love to get this guy in a room and ask him what he thinks Bolshevism, Maoism, and whatever else is. I can guarantee you he wouldn't have the faintest idea. Firstly, he somehow can read into the minds of millions of Soviet communists because he confidently states that they weren't working towards an egalitarian society, despite the fact that socialist societies have been far more egalitarian than your beloved social democracies built on the blood of third world bodies. Secondly, right-wing totalitarian perversions of Marxism. And who exactly made you the authority? You can't even define socialism right. How in the hell would you know they're right wing? I swear this guy just swallowed the horseshoe theory nonsense in high school and never thought about it since. If Marxism and Leninism is right wing, and fascism is right wing, so what is left over that can be considered to be left wing? Centrism? Jesus Christ. Totalitarian is a buzzword with no actual meaning, so shove that. Literally an ideological term invented to equate Marxism and fascism. The perversion part is arguing from ignorance. He doesn't know the first thing about Marxism, as he's clearly shown. What that leaves you with is Bolshevism and Maoism are Marxism, of which I'd agree, despite the fact that Bolshevism isn't an ideology, much in the same vein Stalinism, Castroism, and whatever else equally aren't real ideologies. Now onto the images. Why is Pol Pot there? No Marxist upholds him or the actions of the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot was a Philistine when it comes to socialism, somehow knowing less than our buddy Pakman about it, and need I remind you, was supported by the CIA. Neat tidbit, his nonsense was brought down by Soviet-backed Socialist Vietnam, so yeah. These types really are indistinguishable from Cold War anti-communists, aren't they?
In direct contrast to Marxism and other forms of state socialism is libertarian socialism.
Fucking... Insert the video of the guy going, ah, ah. Aye. Alright, I made a video on this titled Libertarian Socialism with Authoritarian Characteristics that you can check out here,
where there's an emphasis on having a state that is either small and decentralized or completely non-existent. One version of libertarian socialism is anarchism.
I'm genuinely surprised at how well he can either incompetently define or be completely wrong about this stuff. Regardless, what you want doesn't matter. Marxist-Leninists, too, want a state that is small and decentralized. Thing is, that's a quick one-way ticket to being overthrown, invaded, sabotaged, and crushed by hostile capitalist forces all around you. Former socialisms developed strong centralized states with internal security apparatuses because they were forced to, not because they simply got up one day and did it. Fascist violence, vindictive former landlords and capitalists who see themselves as having been wronged, sabotage sponsored by capitalist powers, all of these things need to be suppressed, and fluffy language does little more than show you haven't thought longer than 2 seconds about this. This nonsense infuriates me because it takes the immutable nature of politics from liberal bullshit and poisons leftist discourse with it. Conservatives are just stupid, liberals are just white guilt gays. No class analysis, nothing substantial, just character archetypes. Some people have authoritarian personalities and as a result gravitate towards Marxism-Leninism. Yes, pee-pee-poo-poo, I am very smart. Literally mind over matter bullshit. Rather than the material conditions shaping ideological outlooks, or better yet, a materialist analysis regarding the world around you, people have inherent dispositions. Really not too far off from fascist discourse. After this, he goes on to misdefine anarchism by separating the anti-capitalist part out of it, and then begins to talk about Catalonia as an example of successful socialism despite several issues with the idea that I'm too tired to go through. Regardless, as mentioned before, Catalonia had similar issues in regards to coercive institutions as the USSR, just on a smaller scale, as it was a much shorter-lived experience. Generally and historically, the several quote-unquote libertarian experiments, like Catalonia, use those same methods that impede or set restrictions on personal liberty, be they forced conscription, labor camps, labor enforcement laws and officers, etc. That's somewhat of a principal point. No matter how libertarian some experiment hopes to be, the material conditions usually force quote-unquote authoritarian action to be taken because they are effective. Again, if Catalonia had survived and established itself as a threat to global capitalism, you would have been deriding it as some evil right-wing perversion of socialism, just like Cuba, the USSR, etc. Side note, he quotes Orwell, but spells the name Orwell with an extra E, which I found funny. Regardless, Orwell was an absolute piece of shit that reported communists, Jews, and members of minority groups to the secret police. Also, a shit writer, rapist, colonial cop, and eternal propagandist whose works have literally been subsidized by the CIA for decades. Not the guy that you want to be quoting. Anyways, he goes on to point to the EZLN, better known as the Zapatistas, who exist at the mercy of the Mexican state and have achieved no meaningful development of socialism or dismantling of capitalism. I'm not trying to denigrate Catalonia or the Zapatistas, but we need to speak bluntly here. You see, what happens when you disregard all the actual examples of socialism, because they've been actively demonized to you by capitalist press and educational systems with a stake in villainizing them to you, you end up sorting through the scraps looking for whatever is left, grasping at whatever 2-week or 2-month-long experiment that barely organized even simple artisanal production, let alone modern industry on socialist terms. Having a cooperative chicken farm is one thing, organizing systemic nationwide vaccination for 40 million children is another. Cute horizontal organization in a village commune is one thing. Strict military discipline and a modern, transnational, centralized and planned economy defeating the Nazis is another. Again, this is not meant to insult those other examples. I do accept them as valid attempts, and I'm humbled by the fact that they still nonetheless attempted to achieve something. But rejecting all major socialist examples only ends you up with experiments that were immediately crushed from the outside because they know if you attempt in their example, the same thing that happened to them will happen to you. All of this, by the way, is in reply to a social democrat that doesn't agree with either option, be it ML or anarchist, in the first place. All the rest of the video is circle jerking over Nordic model countries, just don't look at where they export weapons to, thinking small-scale cooperative agriculture in some pre-feudal society is socialism, or socialistic, a term that means fuck all, or is a repeat of his other mistakes that I've covered already in another video titled David Pakman is Liberal Propaganda, which you can watch here. To say I'm disappointed would be an understatement. Honestly, it's easier to deal with outright anti-communists because at least there's some honesty in their idiocy, unlike Pakman and his Schrodinger's socialism. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll go and drink some wateristic, nondescript Newtonian fluid that I promise you is real water, unlike the right-wing perversion that comes out of your taps. And that's it for this time. Apologies, the next video will be more educational.